Hello and welcome to the Cyber Minds podcast, a podcast where we get to meet and explore the minds of thought leaders in the cybersecurity and technology world. My name is Mark Williams and I am the founder of Quigley Cyber. At Quigley Cyber, we work with clients to provide the best cybersecurity resources and services to help you build the best teams and solutions. And as we say at Quigley Cyber, it's always about the people. So because the strength of your cybersecurity capability is always about the people, in this podcast, we get to meet some of those people that make this industry so great. Sam Mackenzie is a driven technology and cybersecurity leader with 25 years of experience dedicated to protecting and advancing critical infrastructure. As a valued committee member of both the Australian Control Rooms Network Association and the Australian Computer Society, Sam is known for his structured thinking, his talent for simplifying complex challenges, and his ability to harness culture as a catalyst for meaningful change. Sam also has a very keen interest on the SOCI Act, the Security of Critical Infrastructure, which I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with hands-on experience in 7 of the 11 sectors of that Act. Sam, welcome to the Cyber Minds podcast.
Excellent. Thanks for having me.
Now, before we get into the details of the pod, when we caught up recently, you talked to me about traveling around San Francisco with your family in a fully autonomous vehicle. Can you talk to us all about that? Because I don't think many of us would have experienced that.
Yeah, sure. So the organisation is called Waymo, and like a few organisations are testing fully autonomous vehicles. It took us from where we wanted to go to, where we were at our service department through to the event. Probably I would have preferred to go in it by myself rather than take the whole family, but that's how the cookie crumbled, and I just went for it. I mean, it was at the time cheaper than an Uber, Saturday night, 5 p.m, and quite a bit cheaper, like less than half price. Obviously, there's no driver involved. They are fully autonomous. They've got an emergency response centre where they can give guidance to the vehicle, but the vehicle makes the end decisions. And it was quite an unusual feeling being in a vehicle where the steering wheel's turning and I was in the passenger seat. The seatbelt's clipped in. It's a Jaguar I-Pace electric vehicle. The kids were convinced that there was an invisible person driving. They're little kids. So we went along with that for a bit. But it was incredible to experience how safe it was, how well it navigated, unusual, traffic circumstances. Stuck to the speed limit, avoided pedestrian walking on the road. I mean, it did do an unusual U-turn at the start, which sort of raised our eyebrows, just as to where, some other people were loading a car. But I think we've all been there and done an unusual U-turn. So that was, it wasn't really of any significance. But I guess the thing I really noticed was the amount of time that you get back as the people who are usually navigating and driving. So I got to really interact with the family and experience and share more about the experience with them. So it was very rewarding. And I can see that, at least in metropolitan areas, I don't know that there's going to be much need for my kids to get a driver's license in the 10, 12, 15 years as to when they'll need them.
Yeah. And since we spoke and since you did that journey, Tesla have launched their robo-taxi service as well. I think that might be in Austin. So yeah, it's for me, it's exciting. I've been waiting for this for a long time, but it seems just in the past 12 months, there's been some really big moves forward in the autonomous vehicle space. So bring it on, I say.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting space. I mean, if we're talking about critical infrastructure, control rooms, how we manage autonomous fleets, that is obviously really ramping up, and we need to ensure that we're protecting, our society through those implementations.
Yeah, no doubt. Security is super important in those scenarios. Now, getting into it, how would you explain the role of cybersecurity in keeping our power, water, transport, and essential services safe to someone who's never had a lot of experience with computing.
Yeah, I mean, leading on from that conversation about the Waymo, the robot taxi, I mean, many years ago, um, that equipment was controlled by individual humans, say turning valves or pulling levers, on a train track. But today, all of that's controlled by computers, and obviously cars even more so now. Um, switching electricity circuits, moving trains around, that was all done manually by hand. And as things have become faster and more efficient, they've become more electronic. So with the um, how that's worked, and not just electronic, they've become digital. So they've taken sort of a number of steps along that journey. It's much more efficient. It's faster. You can centrally control things. You can use less human resources, less people. Therefore, the costs are there's significant benefits to the costs. But it does sort of mean that those computers are vulnerable, to cyber attacks, and therefore the physical world, the built environment, as it's sometimes called, is then at risk. So things like shutting down cranes that run port operations, shutting down high flow national fuel pipelines, from a protectionist perspective, if they were under ransomware attack, or causing large, water silos or tanks to overflow. And all those are some of the possible outcomes, and in fact, all of those three outcomes have occurred. One of them in Australia, two of them in the US. And so cybersecurity is what protects those systems. It's effectively like locking, digital doors and making sure that only the right people have access to them to stop attackers from entering. Or at least to slow them down so that you can switch to manual controls and protect the built environment.
Yeah, yeah,
Even if you've never touched a computer, daily life depends on it for everybody.
yeah, yeah. And I suppose it's interesting to consider um, with what's happening with AI at the moment. Obviously, that's the buzzword kicking around with a lot of justification, I suppose. And I'm not extraordinarily technical, but I imagine a lot of those systems currently leverage automation. But going from automation to AI is a massive leap, and again, a lot of those systems currently wouldn't be able to go to jump to AI because of regulatory restrictions. But at some point, they will, and then I suppose the query arises: well, if there's been a glitch, can we work out whether the AI glitched or has there been a breach? That can present some challenges in the future, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess sort of while I was thinking about some of these topics, so I went back to the fuse box in your house. So that's an automated system that protects you by using a grounded circuit and switching. And if the toaster's got something stuck in it and it starts to use too much power, then it flicks, and it flicks much faster than someone can realize that and do it themselves. So it's a life-saving protection. And the running the power grid is got similar protections in it in regards to high voltage switching infrastructure to protect and cut off those sections of power. And yeah, as we get into AI, the AI is going to be much faster than humans at doing this stuff if it's implemented carefully and correctly. But and the drive to do that is obviously monetary benefit and gain as well as safety. But then how do we balance that effectively that dichotomy of what happens if someone else starts to control it? So that's going to be fascinating to watch and is currently playing out.
Yep, yep, absolutely. Now, speaking of fascinating to watch, I did watch the new Marvel movie with my daughter last weekend, which leads us to the question of your cybersecurity origin story in a very roundabout fashion. Um, I know it's a really interesting one, and one that I am kind of familiar with. So, can you please tell us all your origin story?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a few different takes on it. I've shared it a few times, but I've got a slightly different take to share with you today. So it still relates back to when I grew up on a country farm in Victoria. It was a breathtaking vista of rolling hills and then flatlands of farmland, and we didn't have much in the way of resources, but we did have, like a lot of small farms, veggie patch. We had an orchard and we had a chicken coop, and there was adversaries out there, just like in the cyber world, who were trying to get to those. So the rabbits were trying to get to the veggie patch, the birds were trying to always get to the fruit trees, and the foxes were trying to get to the chickens. And we were defending against them every season, um, and mostly unsuccessfully. Probably the first few seasons, as the fences got higher and higher, and the rabbits and foxes continued to go over those, um, and and even the scarecrow. I mean, scarecrows don't work, basically. You need to net your fruit trees, and sort of that learning that increased protection. Um, each season, so we electrified the fences, and so the foxes go under. And so then the next season, you dig the fences into the ground, 2 or 3 feet into the ground, so they can't go over with rabbit mesh. And so protecting those, personal assets, has instilled that it's had a profound effect on me as to how important those assets were as a child. Um, and so that's played out in my career as the majority of organisations that I've worked in my career have been in critical infrastructure, and it's really important to me.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Very, very interesting. And I think the big takeaway from that is that scarecrows don't work. They're
Yeah,
everywhere, but they don't
and
work.
there's probably some parallel I could draw to the cyber world, but I haven't quite got there yet.
Something to workshop.
Yeah.
All right. Now you've got a strong interest and focus on cybersecurity, but your career, or in your career, you continue to lead both traditional technology and cyber. Why is that? Why have you kind of kept a foot in both camps?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important for leaders, particularly in critical infrastructure, that they have skills, across the breadth of some of how the service is being delivered. So even business leaders to have some technology awareness and to have some cybersecurity awareness. I think being a technology leader for so long myself, cyber was a natural progression to include in my portfolio of focus, because it's going to be very hard to be like a chief information officer, a CTO, without having some decent awareness of cyber nowadays. And similarly, it would be hard to be a CISO, as a chief information security officer, without having a good grounding in technology. So I think it accumulates into being a more rounded leader.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I think over the last uh, decade in particular, but for many going back prior to that, it was seen important that a CEO and boards had an understanding of technology, because we did have a stage there, and even still to some extent, where you just had boards who were generally more mature people who didn't really get technology, which made them less effective, I would argue. Now I think we've jumped to the point where it's important that they understand cybersecurity as well. So your CEO and your boards, and really your whole leadership team, have to understand cybersecurity, because it has to be uh, an all-encompassing approach within the organisation, and therefore the leaders have to get it.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that's going to be. It is hard for a board to get across so many different disciplines. Obviously, they're focused on the service offering and return on value. If they've got if they ask the right questions and have you know um, good advisory from specialists in the space that they can lean on, then they perhaps don't need to. In some organisations, have depth of knowledge in cyber. I would say. I know there's a lot of people advocating for them to know all about cyber. I think it's probably a stretch at some organisations. I guess some organisations you could argue similarly. Everybody should have medical understanding, but say a healthcare organisation makes sense to have medical expert on the board.
Mm.
But for a startup, technology SaaS provider, perhaps not. So whereas and you might argue the opposite for cybersecurity. So I think there's room to flex depending on the business focus and organisation, but either way, they need to make sure they're asking the right cyber questions and getting that advice into the boardroom.
Yeah, and look, there's a growing number of organisations delivering board training in cyber, and in most cases, it's really just the basics, because I've had CISOs explain to me that they had a board member saying, "Well, over the last 5 years we've spent however many million on cybersecurity. Isn't that enough? Can we stop now?" Like,
Yeah.
when you're dealing with that sort of attitude, that really hamstrings you. So I think it's at the very, very least just some basic education.
Yeah, and I think just following on from that, the Australian Institute of Company Directors, I think it was the chair, came out late last year to highlight that for Australian companies, it's expected that the directors are taking responsibility. So in whatever capacity that means. So I always advocate, like you're saying, for that base level awareness and training, and make sure either, depending on your business, you have someone who's good knowledge in cyber, or that you're getting the right advisory.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. Now, in our past discussions, you've mentioned the term cyber physical incident. Can you talk to us about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think we sort of touched on some of that a little bit earlier, but it is a definition, and it's where there's negative physical outcomes from a digital event. So to date, Australia's gotten off lightly, um, but it's really around that built environment. So, transport, water, power, gas, those environments getting disrupted, potentially building management systems, those are getting disrupted by digital, when a cyber criminal reaches in digitally and causes an impact. Those devices, the actuators, the pumps, the high capacity circuit breakers in power, they're all uh, sort of, you could refer to them as dumb in some regards, in that they do what they're told. So they don't know if what they're doing is going to cause a negative outcome. They just do what they're told, and if that's a bad actor who's instructing them, then they will just follow along. Um, so, some of those examples I mentioned before could cause, safety impact, water tanks to overflow, and I guess it's we've been lucky in Australia to date.
Yeah, yeah. And so you touched on an attack that had occurred in Australia. Can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
Yeah, there's a few. I guess we actually got put on the map as having the first cyber physical incident back in the year 2000 in Maroochy Shire in Queensland. It was effectively what we refer to as an insider attack. So a disgruntled contractor wasn't off-boarded completely, and they were asked to leave the organisation. They still had account access, and they got back into the operational technology systems and released hundreds of thousands of litres of raw sewage into parkland. Um, so it's not often cited as the first cyber physical attack, because arguably it was a person that did it, but they still had access. So from identity and access management, the processes could have prevented that if they were cut off at the appropriate time. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Deep in shit. Fantastic.
Exactly.
Now,
Yeah.
I mean, and look, it's a basic example, but a really good one of why identity and access management is so important, and clearly illustrates the folly of not being on top of it. And that's a really basic example, right? Um, but if these incidents are so rare, why should we care about a cyber physical incident?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is that they are so risky to life. I mean, that sewage was in parkland, so arguably it didn't affect too many people. It wasn't in people's homes. It didn't back up the loos. It didn't cause a sanitation or humanitarian challenge. Um, but it could.
Yep.
And um, I guess there was actually news overnight out of the NHS, has confirmed that the ransomware that their third-party provider, pathology provider, had actually contributed to the death of a patient. So, and that's incredibly unfortunate and tragic event, but it's not unexpected that that's been coming. So it's 2 years ago that event happened, and there's many more that have occurred that I guess are hard to attribute And not that we're trying to attribute them, but I guess the opportunity to understand how those events occur gives us room to prevent them in future.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that is tragic. I hadn't heard that, but the NHS has been involved in so many breaches. Unfortunately, to some degree, it was just a matter of time before there was an attributable death. And I mean, medical infrastructure around the world and definitely including Australia are being targeted frequently. Uh, and yet, it doesn't seem that, from what I'm witnessing and hearing, cybersecurity is still not being taken seriously by that sector to the degree that it should and to the degree that it needs to be. But then you could probably argue that for most sectors.
Yeah, I think, it's incredibly difficult for, I guess, to concept to share with sort of the general population, and therefore it perhaps doesn't get the focus that I think it needs. It's also there's an aversion about attributing. It was one of the compounding factors to the event, and I guess there's other examples in Australia, I guess, around hospitals. Again, we haven't really seen any clear linkages because there's not really benefits to the hospitals to share that. Um, uh, a, a slightly different example is Fire Rescue Victoria. 2 years on, are still in some manual processes for their dispatch systems. Is what I'm hearing from people on the ground, and that must impact the delivery of the service somehow. It might only be by 10, 20, 30 seconds, which therefore you can't really attribute, but there's impact.
No doubt, no doubt. Yeah, I've heard about Fire Rescue Victoria as well. And yeah, I mean, there's a reason that we go digital. It's for that operational efficiency and to some degree effectiveness. And that inefficiency, when it's engineered into your processes, has to have a significant impact over the course of 12 months in how efficiently you can operate, how efficiently you can deploy resources, identify issues that need to be addressed. It has to have a big impact.
Yeah, and there's lots of other challenges there, I guess, around what happens if there's cascading failures as a concept. So, and you start to see that with an event like CrowdStrike or power outages, as particularly if they start to go on for a number of days, it starts to impact other services. So, if you think about a hospital can run without power usually for a number of days because they've got generators and they can get more diesel. Usually, assuming the petrol station's open, but they can't really run without water for very long. Most of them, some of them have reserve water supplies, but not a week's worth. And so the patient care starts to become very difficult should those sort of services be impacted and cascading failures of critical infrastructure occur.
Mm.
So, it's not to take away the importance of things with, data breaches and stuff that we've seen, but they're starting to be more common, these cyber physical incidents. And I think we're going to need to start stepping up to the plate across critical infrastructure, across the leadership and identification of that risk, treatment of that risk, mitigation. And the government's doing a lot. The government's doing a lot in regards to the SOCI Act that you mentioned before. But at some stage, the customers are going to need to pay for some of this improvement in security as well, which is potentially going to be hard to swallow given cost of living, etc.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think there's always stuff that goes wrong, and as you say, there can be compounding impacts. So I did hear a story a few years ago of a regional hospital that lost their power. There'd been a big storm. They lost their power. The lines were down. Took quite a long time for the lines to be repaired. Um, they, and I don't understand how this happened. They ran out of diesel. And of course, because the power was down, the service stations couldn't pump. And so they were relying on local farmers coming around and dropping diesel off to keep the power on in the hospital. And it worked, but it's not something you'd want to rely on. And in this case, it was a storm, but it could have been a cyber attack. and it could have gone on a lot longer, and then you would have seen some really significant potential, loss of life.
Mm. Yeah, I hadn't heard about that. I mean, that wasn't in their business continuity plan.
No.
Yeah, it was a good solution to a difficult situation.
Yeah, I think it's great that this perspective that you've brought to the pod around cyber physical. I know that there's a very slowly growing focus within organisations around operational technology, because a lot of that can have a direct physical impact, and most of those technologies, or certainly a large percentage of them, have been created in the past and even still are these days without a focus on cybersecurity, and they're just little devices that follow a specific function, deliver a specific function. They're not built to be patched. It's a real challenge for a lot of industries that have that sort of technology in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the cybersecurity legislative package from last year is going some ways to help with that in regards to requirements for manufacturers who make that equipment to ensure that it is patchable, and that they are releasing patches for a length of time. I think it's 10 years.
Mm.
Um, and that will go a great way to helping, but it's not enforceable for 18 months, I think. And like you say, that there's long lifespans on this equipment. Some of that stuff's maybe got another 10 years. If that's been implemented a year or two ago, it could have 20 years to go, some of that equipment. So how do we manage that? There's ways to isolate things and segregate, and to protect if you can't patch. But yeah, we're definitely gonna need to take this stuff more seriously. And there's the concept, that does do that, called cyber-informed engineering, which is growing in, which is a growing, community discipline, and is starting to be required in some areas.
Yep, yep, yeah. No, that's good to hear about that. Now, you are active on LinkedIn. You publish a lot. You speak on panels. You volunteer on a number of security-related boards. I guess the question I have is why and where does that sense of community come from? And it does seem to be a common sense from a lot of our pod guests.
Yeah, I'm really passionate, as you've sort of heard from my origin story and hopefully through what I've been sharing, about having better cyber physical safety. And e-safety, yes, that's really important, but the cyber physical stuff where there's potentially negative outcomes. And I feel that if we get community together, to share the learnings and hold an event where, say, a risk manager in finance has a conversation, and I saw this at one of our events recently, has a conversation with a chemical engineer in the water domain, that a light comes on, and they both go back to their respective workplaces with a better understanding of how to protect their critical infrastructure, how to protect the environment and our society. And I think that that's super important to me, to build that community. And so some of it's around, a new structure and community that we're calling Cybersecurity for Critical Infrastructure, the CS4CI community. And we're trying to get people together, share good practice, hold events so that people can have those conversations, because it is important and it needs to go alongside and support what the government's doing and what organisations are struggling to implement.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's great to hear. And I had a discussion on previous pod with David Lucci about this. Just the importance of bringing together people with diverse experiences, because there's no point bringing together a whole bunch of people that have had the same experience. There's not a lot to be learned or shared, but diversity of experience, diversity of background are really how we can all grow and improve our knowledge and capability across the industry.
Absolutely. And I think there's some examples there in regards to how we manage cyber risk and particularly cyber physical risk. Because I published a white paper called Securing Society recently, and it occurred to me through the research that I did and the interviews that I held through that work, that cyber physical risk. I know there was the Maroochy Shire event in the year 2000, but effectively you can pin the first sort of cyber physical incident on the world stage as being Stuxnet, which was the supposed Israeli-American malware that was in the Iranian nuclear facility Natanz, which has obviously been in the news a lot lately. And so from that, if you look at that, that's 15 years ago, so 2009, 2010, when the news broke about that event. But if you look to what I sort of call the parents of risk, like financial and safety, they're about 150 years old. So they occurred, and if you look back through history, there's some examples in the paper about a bridge that fell down called the Tay Bridge, and about a railway that blew its budget. So in those examples, they forever changed engineering for safety and financial management for projects delivery. I know we still struggle with the financial management one a lot, but engineering is really quite well under control from a safety perspective in most, Western nations, for want of another term.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to be, like, it feels like, not that we need to play catch up, but there's a lot of benefits and shoulders that we can stand on of giants from using those methodologies, that language, that risk treatment, the calculations as to how they've managed what was previously incalculable risk, and that we can leverage that and accelerate our cyber risk management journey.
Yeah, no doubt. Why reinvent the wheel when others have done it for us? All right. Now, just one final question. If you could give one piece of advice to someone aspiring to become a cybersecurity leader, what would it be?
So I have had a few thoughts about this question. There's probably a lot of superpowers that you need to have to be successful. I think that I'm probably going to have to give two. You need to be a compassionate and supportive leader, whatever sort of leader you are, would be my view, and supportive of your team to help them do the best that they can. Often they refer to, a cybersecurity event as being the worst day of your, career. But I would say in cybersecurity, you're having those days more frequently. But the key sort of superpower that I would say that they need, aside from obviously being a great leader and compassionate, would be to have really relentless prioritization, and to be really able to distill what are the key risks, which ones are the ones that we're going to need to raise to executive and board level, and which ones do we need to address, now, tomorrow, or the next day, and so that you can prioritize the work, because there's thousands of alerts coming in some organizations, hundreds of thousands. You've got to be able to sort through that and make judgment calls and work out how to get the support, budget, team that you need to address them.
Yep. Yeah, very good. Yeah, look, prioritization. It's a skill that we, I suppose you've got kids at school. Yours might be a bit young, but once they get to senior school, they have to learn to prioritize, and they've got exams coming up. They've got to prioritize which subjects require the most attention, or prioritize actually studying rather than going out with friends. It starts then, and it just keeps evolving as we get older and as our careers develop, and it becomes ever more important once you get to those more senior leadership roles.
Yeah, and I think it's more acute today because of the amount of information that's coming in.
Mm.
So there's a concept called it's about attention, attention budget, attention. It's effectively that we've only got a finite amount of attention. How do we best utilize and prioritize that attention that we've got for the 16 hours a day that we're awake?
Yep. Fantastic. Oh, that's a great note to finish on. We started on invisible men driving cars, and we finished with that. That's been brilliant. Thanks, Sam. It's been a pleasure to have you as a guest on the Cyber Minds podcast, and I look forward to continuing to read your white papers and follow your publications and hear and see you in panels. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mark.
Brilliant. Cheers.